To start by thanking all of you for inviting me to be part of this conversation, not least because I'm a huge fan of Mozilla and the WebMaker tools, and I use them regularly as part of the courses I teach, especially my digital literacies class. The high school teachers that I collaborate with also find them extraordinarily useful in their practice. I heard Doug's colleagues present on this framework at an EdTech-oriented conference when the framework had just come out. And I'm particularly happy to see from Doug's talk that some of the iterations that have occurred since that time, including the move that you referenced, Doug, in from calling them standards to framing this as a map. So some of the parts that resonate with me in this project, I really appreciate the commitments to openness and transparency, which can help guide us towards multiple diverse perspectives and voices, and which connects us very nicely to the LRA theme of dialogicality. I also appreciate the framing of the internet as a global public resource that should be protected, and Mozilla's leading role in that effort. I appreciate the acknowledgement of the political nature of this work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later because I think I'm going to push you a little bit in thinking about that political dimension. I also appreciate the foregrounding of the educative dimensions of this work. That is the need for apprenticeship modeling and teaching of what you're calling web literacies. And finally, I appreciate the community-based orientation that's manifested in your practice of training the teachers to teach the web, for example, and which of course helps us think about the ways youth can do this or anyone with willingness and access. And I very much appreciate you taking the time, Doug, today to report on the feedback about the first iteration of the framework. In referring back to the proposals that you have summarized so nicely for us, I agree with all of them except the second one, that there could be a tighter and more explicit alignment between the manifesto and the map. Seems great to me. That this should look more like a map, I agree with. I agree that some of the concepts appear to be cross-cutting ones and might be helpful to reorganize in that direction. And I also agree that there should be a way to remix the map for various purposes. All of these seem very well aligned with what I'm going to say today and with the larger vision that Doug has so helpfully already laid out for us. My critique of the second proposal, which was to rename the three strands reading, writing, and participating, I'll explain in a moment as part of my broader feedback about this framework and indeed my discomfort around it. I commend you, Doug, and the organizers of this session for reaching out to the literacy scholars to help you think through the entailments of your decision to frame this project within the literacy paradigm. So you asked for a read on this project, and in response I'd like to make 4 points. The first one, which is really the biggie. So certainly my biggest source of concern is the way that this framework invokes literacy in very particular and historically significant ways. In the very definition we hear the skill orientation, web literacy involves, quote, the skills and competencies needed for reading, writing, and participating on the web. As you so rightly point out, definitions are powerful things. And defining web literacy as comprised of autonomous skills that can be mapped in linear fashion powerfully invokes a particular model of literacy that folks in the new literacy studies tradition have been working very hard to complicate. The popular definition of literacy traditionally revolves around the notion of ability. One can or cannot read. So we have information literacy, emotional literacy, financial literacy, glossed as the ability to competently use information, emotions, or money, respectively. This definition has a long history rooted in the use of the word illiteracy, which was used for 220 years before literacy came into popular use. This history thus calls forward into the present day the deficitizing ideology, in which literacy is a binary, you can or cannot read or write, and an autonomous set of skills that in and of themselves have an effect on people outside of the social context of their use. So given this history, I'm wary of the use of the word literacy here in the web literacy framework, notably in the singular, as if there's one kind of web literacy. From the very definition to the way the map is arrayed, I find this logic of traditional understandings of literacy at play. One of my broadest worries is that when large institutional entities, including Mozilla, take up and amplify these older and problematic notions of literacy, they become even more cemented into our cultural fabric, more transparent and seemingly uncomplicated. So, in some ways, that's why I find it troubling that you bring up the proliferation of umbrella terms, but ultimately dismiss this as a kind of semantic debate. There are so many definitions that it's impossible to figure out, is the implication. I encourage everyone at Mozilla to think about the cultural sway you hold and to think deeply and carefully about your definitions and the ideologies they carry. These matter, they're not just semantic, and they have very real consequences for how people are measured, ranked, and sorted. The second point I'd like to make, which is connected really to this first point, is about how and where criticality emerges in the map. By that, I mean I'd like to see more explicitly some recognition that even as we make the web makes us. How do we balance the public good with commercial interests? Which is a point that you make in the manifesto. If these are a set of autonomous skills through which, quote, people should be able to show what they know and can do with the web, then that implies that once one has acquired this expertise, that these skills lead directly to outcomes. This locates the agency within the skills themselves and frames them as neutral. I think this is an area of tension, for while you say that web literacy is political, and as a company you take a particular stance towards openness and the common good, this framework does imply a neutral process of acquiring skills that lean unproblematically to particular outcomes, which is not particularly political. What happens when we shift these to a practice-oriented approach, I wonder? One that focuses on the ways that practices are situated in activities and always in relation to other people and things. And I urge you to start thinking about, as Rick Beach mentioned in his comments, this kind of practice framework, which really does highlight criticality and help us think about the political nature and the ideological nature of all practices. So my third point is related to these previous two, but it's a more minor point, and it's really about the question of pathways that you bring up. There's a sense that development is linear here, that we develop expertise over time and that we move from novice to expert. But there are many other developmental pathways, particularly in networked crowdsourced culture in which people learn through multiple possible directionalities. For example, how might the Imago framework fit here? Drawing on Ito and colleagues in the MacArthur and digital and media and learning field, we can think about the ways connected learning involves many kinds of pathways, including hanging out, messing around, and geeking out. Again, I do appreciate your attempts to mitigate this criticism by explicitly stating that this is not a linear process. But there's still logic in the definition, in the representation, in the framing, that there's a correct way to become an expert. For example, in your future goals, you say, quote, first we want to build clear learning pathways that lead to meaningful credentials. People should be able to show what they know and can do with the web. That's likely to start with the Web Literacy Basics 101 and will probably use open badges. So even in that framing, we see that there's a particular kind of pathway and one particular kind of expertise, as Chris Gutierrez has helped us understand in a lot of her work about the multiple pathways that people take, that there's horizontal forms of expertise and knowledge and learning as well that we need to take advantage of. So this definition really reveals that there are pathways that you have in mind, even though in other parts you say that that's not explicitly the goal. So I think that these pathways can, if framed in these particular ways, constrain the way people do learn and make sense of the web. So my last point, I just want to call attention, and this really does draw directly from the last point about pathways, but I really want to call attention to the way that our representations have important implications. So the fact that this is a map, but is oriented as if these are still standards, matters. By separating these into 3 columns, there's a linearity that implies a separation and progression of skills. Indeed, you really began today by talking about this as a competency grid. Where are the relationships and connections between items, but also between columns? The proposal that you mentioned earlier to look at cross-cutting themes is a good one, but I think it needs to go further. Are there ways to represent these as practices that are somehow connected in relationship to one another? We know that reading, writing, and participating are not separate activities in practice, so the fact that they're separate here and that the separateness is reinforced by the columnar structure feels like a very modular, skills oriented framing that has particular implications for learning. Certainly, having these individually articulated the way you do for each item, if we click into each item, is brilliantly helpful for anyone wanting to teach or learn these, and these are very well articulated. However, when looking at them as a whole, any focus on fluidity, connection, intersectionality remains hidden. For a company that's about openness and network teaching and learning, this competency grid model fits an older, outdated model of learning, one that does not yet recognize the multiple pathways to learning and participating, and that frames these as neutral skills without consequences or repercussions, and that can operate on their own. So these are my 4 points, but I want to loop back around to commend you for the way that you've gone about engaging in this conversation. I think that this process of making it open and transparent and inviting all of us into dialogue really does speak very well for your efforts to make this a crowdsourced project and to think about web literacies in relationship to other frameworks that other people are working on. And it clearly indicates the kind of energy and thought that you've contributed to make the web open and accessible to everyone. Thanks again for inviting me.